Well, this has been something I've been holding in for the last couple of years. There's a lot of theories to how the world will end. Global warming, disease, Cthulhu, but after rewatching Force Awakens, I have a new theory that mankind will eventually die out from mass lobotomy from a culture of pretty images devoid of communicative or thoughtful value. I can't be the only one who's noticed there's this consistent descent into an era of mediocre script writing. It's not overtly apparent, but it can be felt. A new cultural reliance on stories that isn't rooted in immersing and exploring honest ideas or communicating authentic feelings, but rather a reliance on a collection of old, familiar narrative cliches that can be organized to make something that'll last for 2 hours and can qualify as a movie on a technical level, but is actually devoid of any particular human substance. It feels like we're living in a culture where we're constantly given a bag of sugar rather than an actual meal. I mean, once in a while we'll get a big film that actually provides something, but they always feel so far in between. People accepted Force Awakens when it first came out just because it wasn't the prequels, but it's safe to say now that that specific itch is scratched with so many classic looking Star Wars films from the last 4 years that Force Awakens is looking more and more unremarkable in retrospect, but unfortunately, it has all the hallmarks of this modern day growing issue. And let me preface this by saying that I don't think Force Awakens is a god-awful movie by any means, or unwatchable. I'm not insane or blinded by emotion enough to disregard that it was made by passionate people, but every time I rewatch it, it feels like I'm getting kicked in the balls because there's something genuinely rich and powerful that's ready to blossom, but it's actively being squashed by a terrible and lazy script that takes no risk and therefore there's no reward. It's not a real movie, but an imitation that successfully deceives in its flattery, because Disney has so clearly understood the inherent guaranteed profitability in providing the familiar and the bare minimum. I'm not saying you're an idiot if you like Force Awakens, I'm saying this is why I don't like it and why I feel like I'm an idiot. Or better yet, the last sane person in the f***ing world. Well, I'm tackling the most common criticism head on, which is how Force Awakens rips off the plot to A New Hope. And the problem isn't that it's derivative, unoriginal, cynical, manipulative, artistically bankrupt, lazy, cowardice, redundant, a wasted opportunity, commercially driven, shallow, disrespectful, failure of imagination, and a step in the wrong direction when it comes to the movie industry, because you can take an old story and package something new with it. Nostalgia is ultimately just cosmetics. If you have an original center, then it's still redeemable. But the big problem is that you can't take an old story beat for beat and then transplant new characters in them, because now the themes and ideas are irrelevant to these new characters. The story lacks real estate for these new characters to blossom logically. You see, all Star Wars films, even the prequels, have two large components that feed into each other. A character-driven drama about growing up, and then the very politically pointed backdrop that gives everything a more immersive, communicative depth. The original Star Wars films was about a boy entering the call to action and leaving home to fight an evil empire. It's a very simple hero's journey where the Death Star is a very simple artistic way to articulate the gigantic evilness of the empire, while on an artistic intellectual level the Death Star was basically George Lucas' critique on America during the Vietnam War. This superior technological power that loomed over and destroyed people's homes just because they can, and that the heroes are those brave enough to stand up against it. Everything in the story worked in natural harmony to convey this.
The good guys are the rebels. They're using asymmetric warfare against a highly organized empire. I think we call those guys terrorists.
When I did it, they were Viet Cong.
Exactly. So were you thinking of that at the time?
Yes.
But now for Force Awakens, they took the same story and now it just doesn't line up. Like, if the First Order are an allegory for terrorists this time, why would they be more technologically superior than the government powers? And not only that, but now Rey's story is completely irrelevant to anything. The story about a lonely girl who has no home waiting for her parents, unlike Luke, who's a victim of totalitarianism, has nothing to do with the themes of rebelling against the dominant empire. Unless her parents were taken away by the First Order, or that the First Order is oppressing Jakku, which would have been a really fun direction because they could have explored the relationship of terrorism and the environment and deconstruct the very essence of what differentiates rebellions versus terrorisms. You know, like have Rey grow up with the tales of the heroic rebels only to live in a world where the rebels of her lifetime are the villains. And I'm not saying my idea is amazing by any means, because it would probably make a very boring movie for most people, but you need an understanding of the original material that isn't just shallow images and the events. What we have now with the actual Force Awakens is a movie trapped in another movie. Now, shockingly enough, I'm not going to devolve this discourse and lazily resort to saying that Rey is a Mary Sue because she's a fantasy character, so it's fine. Oh, but how does she know how to fix the Millennium Falcon? And I'm like, do you need special needs? Because they wasted 20 minutes of my life establishing and overly emphasizing her life as a boring scavenger who's grown up wasting her life away, being a boring mechanic fixing shit. So obviously, not only is she good with machines, but the Millennium Falcon is supposed to be an unremarkable bog standard ship.
What a piece of junk!
So why wouldn't she be able to fly it, or fix it? It makes more sense than Luke being able to fly an X-Wing. Like, he may be a good bush pilot, but you've got to know about military fighter plane controls and how to coordinate with the proper procedures with other pilots to do the correct squadron maneuvers without crashing into each other. I doubt during Luke's childhood of drinking from plastic cups with his overly protective elderly aunt and uncle would have taught him that. And I'm not criticizing the original trilogy, I'm just saying that it's not a real problem. It's a thread that doesn't need to be pulled because it doesn't just unravel Force Awakens, but everything. The real problem with Rey is how completely and artistically poorly thought out she is here. Like, I think she's a fantastic character in Last Jedi, because there's some genuinely original, intimate character moments that I thought was genuinely powerful. But here, nothing makes sense in Force Awakens. Like, Rey is supposed to be this young girl who longs for adventure and has great potential, but is pulled down by her own unwillingness to let go of an empty dream of her parents. This is a powerful premise for a character, but it doesn't naturally develop as it should, and all the details in between are just wrong. Like, logically, there should be a moment where she finally lets go of the past and chooses to grow up. For Luke, it was when his frickin' family burned to death. For Rey, you'd think it would either be her becoming best friends with Finn, or Han becoming a surrogate father, or seeing the First Order blowing up all those planets, but there's no moment in the film devoted into letting these relationships and events sink in. When Luke answers the call for adventure, we linger on his sadness, and we see his determination take over, and we experience Obi-Wan's paternal relationship deepening. It feels real, and it's a moment where the audience can really, truly understand the character underneath any protagonist cliches. We don't get the equivalent moment for that for Rey until Last Jedi. We don't have the quiet scene where Finn and Rey have a heart-to-heart, and maybe bond over being abandoned children, which would have been a great way to deepen Rey's search for a home and show that Finn has accepted his place as an emotional nomad. So it's actually heartbreaking when he leaves her, because they both know it's something inevitable. Instead, she's just sort of okay because there he was just some guy that she met after a day. Similarly, again, there's no theme with Han like there was with Luke and Obi-Wan. Like, I can't stress this enough. Everything writes itself, but they couldn't do it. If you really think about it, Han should find Rey as an opportunity to redeem himself as a paternal figure after failing with his actual son, and thus finally give Rey a home, so it would actually matter when he dies. Instead, again, we don't get anything, so he's just some old man that offers her a job, and they don't develop beyond anything more than that. Poor Daisy Ridley trying her best but is given nothing to work with. And the third most baffling opportunity is when the Hosnier system blows up. We see every character's reaction but hers. And instead, I don't think she even knows about it, because the scene we do get of her, she's still focused on wallowing in self-pity. And the point I'm trying to make is that Rey is really poorly written because she's treated as being completely obligatory. These details and nuances that normally create powerful emotional scenes is something you can only get from immersing yourself into the intricacies of the character. Like, we all have different opinions of Last Jedi, but there's a harsh contrast to how Rey is in Last Jedi and how she is in Force Awakens when it comes to the quality of writing. I love how Rian Johnson confronted Rey's illusory dreams of her parents by deflating them, and committed very deeply to the idea that Rey is a lonely person dealing with the pain of isolated self-inadequacy in this fantasy world. But what we end up having here in Force Awakens is not really a character or someone that feels real, but a mascot in development. Not a real protagonist, but someone that seems like a protagonist. Because what we do get are these well-placed but emotionally illogical token main character moments that doesn't make any sense on any natural level. Like, she has the biggest reaction to Han's death, even though Han and Finn has had more screen time together. She hugs Leia, even though she doesn't know who she is. They send Rey to find Luke with no one else but Chewie, even though they probably could have sent someone who's more experienced and is more trustworthy as a representative. The only real good scene is the one between her and Kylo Ren, but that's too little too late. Finn's arc doesn't make any sense, and I'm not talking about why a guy from sanitation would be so proficient with shooting people, or is even on the front lines to begin with. I'm talking about how these clowns destroyed his entire character arc just for one funny reaction from an old character. Like, in theory, Finn's arc should mirror Han Solo's in A New Hope. They're both about characters who are motivated by a sense of self-preservation, but then redeems themselves by coming back at the end. And it's one of the reasons why Han has to shoot Greedo first, because it punctuates the type of person he starts out as, and makes his redemption all the more poignant. Finn, in contrast, is supposed to be a childlike, bumbling guy who can't stomach what his side is doing, and so he abandons the war and tries to run away to save himself. And the moment when he sees the Starkiller base blowing up planets, killing trillions of people, that's when he feels guilty from his own passive position, and so chooses to stop running and to help the good fight. And the movie up to this point does a really good job. He's my favorite character because he naturally develops like a real relatable person. But they couldn't do that right because they added the stupid twist reveal in the end.
Sanitation? Then how do you know how to disable the shields?
I don't. I'm just here to get Ray.
People are counting on us. The galaxy is counting on us.
This character, all about developing maturity, doesn't have his motivations correctly matured. This line causes Finn to completely and utterly deflate. Instead of guilt and responsibility shaping him like a real person and affecting him, instead he's just motivated into wanting to get the girl. And I get the sense that originally his arc was about caring about himself and then also about caring about Rey, but eventually they must have altered it and thought it was a good idea to bring in the third Death Star because presumably the dumb fans would clap upon seeing something recognizable. So it's a character with scenes from two different arcs that negate each other. Like when he talks to Leia, who for some reason looks like a manager at a shop. He's not desperately wanting to help the Resistance, instead it's so then he can trick the Resistance into helping him. Well done, you clowns. Or it's just neglect, because they were like, you know, wouldn't it be funny to see Han's funny reaction if he found out that Finn hadn't changed at all during the whole movie? Either way, this could be rewritten so easily. Just have Finn assume Rey had ran off safely, to make his priorities purely to take out the laser to save lives. Maybe even give him a few more scenes with Poe where he suddenly feels the loving community of the Resistance, rather than the cold military culture of the First Order. Then have him bump into Rey by accident on the base, have her become all proud of him for standing up, and this inspires her to join the fight. Again, I'm not saying this is perfect, but these small details matter. So now Last Jedi is immediately put into the awkward position of, do we follow what Force Awakens thought it did, or do we follow what it actually did? Because Force Awakens thought Finn changed by the end, because it treats him as a hero when he fights Kylo Ren. It thought he was standing up as a new man, but it's really because he's childishly latched onto a girl and she just got hurt. So he's technically still an immature, unchanged child, but ultimately Last Jedi did the brave thing and called Finn out and gave him the arc he should have had here. Now, I like Kylo Ren, but only because of Last Jedi, because he's so confusingly written here. Because are we supposed to take him seriously or not? His introduction is him stopping a laser in midair, which anchors the sense of threatening presence, but the moment is immediately deflated when Poe doesn't take any of it seriously.
It's just very hard to understand you with all the...
Search him.
Like, I'm not saying Poe should be shitting himself, but Leia didn't immediately make fun of Darth Vader's breathing, so I'm getting two complete tonal clashes at once. And the film is littered with these sort of oxymoronic moments, like when he gets pissed off and cuts up the chair. It's really intense, but the emotions are completely trivialized because it's used as a setup for a joke. These two bumbling stormtroopers who are like, oops, here he goes again, boo, boo, boo. Now, you could argue that this is the point, because Kylo Ren is supposed to be an angry child with great destructive power, and it's a story about the untamable wrath of youth. But the problem about this interpretation is that there's an immediate semantic barrier. You can read it as such, but nothing particular is being said because there's very little connotative anchorage. This writing is really lacking in deep characterization. We don't get a moment like Kylo Ren and Hux talking about abducting kids, and Kylo can go off on a rant talking about how fathers don't care if their children are taken away, or have a scene where Kylo has an emotional moment seeing Chewie again because he doesn't have any beef with him, but he's still someone gone forever in his life. And instead we're given nothing. He's effectively a stereotypical Byronic mopey teenage stereotype you see in anime and young adult novels, which is a completely fine archetype to build off of, but Kylo Ren suffers from a lack of strong specific moments. I thought Kylo Ren is a great character in Last Jedi because Rian Johnson identified him as a victim of child abuse that was both a perpetrator and a victim of an unescapable cycle of bad mistakes, but here in Force Awakens there's nothing but just bland dialogue ripped straight from other media for the entire film.
I'm being torn apart.
Poor Adam Driver is trying to make it work, but It literally felt like Lawrence Kasdan and J.J. Abrams just didn't care and was like, well, whoever writes them next can do whatever they want. We don't want to make any prominent commitments with this character, just in case people tear him apart like they did with Anakin. Also, quick digression, Snoke sucks my balls. Like, I remember all the way back in 2015 when I saw him in the cinema, I was like, oh, they don't care, because they can't design a more generic looking villain than a growly voiced bald dude with a scarred face and an evil looking robe. Like, they didn't even try. And I was like, there's nowhere you can go with this character in the future that isn't a generic predictable direction, because whatever you convey with this character will be packaged with this stupid space Voldemort looking guy. Even a goofy sparkling grandpa robe couldn't give the character some personality. No wonder Rian Johnson just killed him off and was like, yeah, he's just a generic relic of the past who exemplified a form of generic evil from a pre-secular culture. Here though, they try to make him intimidating and it just sucks. There's no presence, he's just crap. Yep, I'm gonna moan about this too. Alright, I like Han Solo, not in that weird American male sort of obsession way.
And for the record, my name's not Ted Peterson. It's Han Solo.
But in the original trilogy, he's a great charismatic character that actively steals the show whenever he's around. Apart from in Return of the Jedi, where Harrison Ford for some reason hams it up to children presenters level of goofiness for some reason. But Han is the root of all the problems in Force Awakens, unfortunately. When he shows up, this is when the movie immediately collapses on into itself in such a way that there's no return. The story ceases to invest in the new characters because they cease to drive the direction of the story. All of its attention is now diverted. It's evident even in its introduction, just when the movie gives our new characters finally a moment to naturally develop and to drive the plot. All that real estate is immediately taken away. Han literally shows up to hijack the film. All our new characters suddenly lose their agency and become secondary characters. If the movie cared, they would have taken the opportunity to let the new characters choose to find Han so their motivations can develop. You know, like have Finn recognize that General Solo must be nearby, so he wants to get in touch to get safe passage out of the First Order territory, but Rey wants to go back to Jakku. There's so many possibilities to push these characters in a really natural direction, but no, we get nothing again, because seemingly J.J. Abrams and Lawrence Kasdan just lost their patience and wants to write about the iconic Han Solo and not these two other characters they came up with that was just over there. As a result, Han is this weird preserved mascot in the film, a guy who hasn't changed and developed like a real person in 30 years. I know some people didn't like how Luke was changed in Last Jedi because it discarded decades of beloved continuity that celebrated the character for a completely different isolated direction, and that's a whole different rabbit hole, but that's an artistic character change. Han Solo in Force Awakens is straight up character assassination. Like, at least Luke was deeply affected by his nephew's change. Han didn't change at all upon losing his son.
I was weak, unwise.
Lost Ben Solo, you did.
And the movie tries to explain this by having Leia be like,
I just never should have sent him away. That's when I lost him. That's when I lost you both.
but that doesn't negate what awful people these characters are. There's being flawed and there's giving up on your fucking flesh and blood.
We both had to deal with it in our own way. I went back to the only thing I was ever any good at.
We both did.
Talk about being a bastard. And the movie never addresses this. There's not even a token line of dialogue that indicates that Han had at least spent a decade looking for him or something. Or there's not even a scene where Han is sitting alone in the Millennium Falcon looking sad or anything. Instead, he's still the same smiling, cheeky guy from before. And it's the movie wanting two incompatible things at once. It wants to have Han Solo be the father to Kylo Ren because they want the old fans to accept this new character, but they also just want Han Solo to be exactly how we remembered him. So they haven't committed to their artistic convictions. This great character that was once so realistic and dynamic in the original trilogy is now devolved into just another prop to wave around for a round of applause from the audience, like the Millennium Falcon or any other nostalgic imagery. And it's just sad. Seeing Han Solo in this movie just makes me sad and depressed and be like, is this what Star Wars has come to? And as the cherry on this diarrhea cake is the writing for Han Solo's death. It's so mediocre that I'm scratching my head over what could have been the writing process, because there's no honesty to the scene. It's just a collection of reliable cliches all throughout fiction. It works, but there's no soul. It's the typical, you can change, I believe in you scene. No one is going to reference the lines,
Snoke is using you for your power. When he gets what he wants, he'll crush you.
in the same iconic way as,
Join me. Together, we can rule the galaxy as father and son.
Because Han's final moments doesn't dig deep into anything from his character, and it doesn't help that we have so little amount of insight on Kylo Ren's perspective that when he kills Han, it feels artistically unearned. You can understand the choice to kill Han on a business level, but there's no further value. We're not given any scene between them before the death. All we have is this very unoriginal, safe death scene made up of a series of cliches. This is even more infuriating after Last Jedi, because there's one moment when Luke says,
"In my hubris, I thought I could train him, I could pass on my strengths." Han was Han about it, but
says more than this entire scene, because we learn that Han was so out of his depth of Jedi culture that he was disinterested in his own son's importance. Think about all the narrative opportunities. Did Han even try to bond with his son in the past even though he didn't know anything, and this was a tragic end of something inevitable? Or is it the tragedy of a neglectful father trying to fix his lifelong regret? Think about all the artistic capacity of what could have been done, of what could have been explored. With such a perfect cast, a great director, and having John Williams while he's still alive with a bottomless check from Disney, it's all wasted with a film that has no sense of ambition. Force Awakens in a lot of ways killed Star Wars for me because it didn't look like there was a future for this franchise. It didn't look like there's going to be any new stories or even the desire to seek for them. I look back on the original trilogy and I think of Luke, Han, Leia, and Chewie fighting in the Galactic Civil War. Then I look back on the prequels and I think of Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Padme during the Clone Wars. There was something distinctive about each trilogy. Like any piece of art, George Lucas expressed something vulnerable about his feelings. This beautiful, charismatic universe that was built on the infectious enthusiasm to express something honest. His fears, hopes, beliefs, and dreams, shaped by a world that had constantly changing flaws. So each trilogy was tailored to express his honest emotions about the time. Maybe that made fans feel alienated when the prequels had little resemblance to the original trilogy in terms of execution, but they were films that didn't completely rely on novelty, and because of that, they have value in them. The Rebels and the Empire encapsulated a perspective on the Vietnam War. The Republic and the Separatists said something about the Bush administration. But the struggles between the Resistance and the First Order doesn't encapsulate anything in particular. It doesn't feel like real Star Wars, but a hollow imitation. And I know a lot of people like to say that Force Awakens captured the spirit of Star Wars, but I can't be the only one who believes that the spirit of Star Wars isn't just seeing X-Wings again, or a retreading of A New Hope, but with something complex and more than just silly entertainment. A challenging universe of complex drama and intricate conceptual ideas. It begs the question, if Force Awakens wasn't so preoccupied with nostalgia, there would have been so many possibilities. The film could have discussed the legacy of war, like put emphasis on Jakku being this war-torn planet where Rey is part of a generation of orphans. And so the First Order recruits all the angry young men and women with the promise that they can take revenge on the new government that had abandoned them. Maybe even make Finn one of those kids. Perhaps we could have gone to the Hosnia system and see the largely new secular republic that had forgotten the history of war because of the economic differences, and thus give reason for Rey wanting to help and find Luke so she could change the minds of the type of people she grew up with the only hero left in the galaxy that represented something good in their childhoods. But instead there's absolutely nothing. The Starkiller base is stupid and it completely locks the third act up. Calling the New Republic the Resistance is nonsensical. There's no reason for it apart from nostalgic illusions, because to be called the Resistance you would have to resist the dominant authority, and the First Orders are just a small private group. If they cared, they would have noticed this. It would have made more sense to swap the names around if you think about it, but if the world isn't exactly the same as the fans over 30 remember, then the movie wouldn't be commercially safe. And I'm not saying my version is good, but if the movie just didn't imprison itself with its own sense of nostalgic obligation, then anything would have been possible. A good story should write itself because it takes a life of its own. But instead we're given fan fiction, and not even good fan fiction, one written by a 13-year-old, like, "My idea for episode 7 is that it's like episode 4 but with a girl, Luke, and a stormtrooper becomes her best friend, and they fight a bigger Death Star. And Han Solo is in the most of it." I can't have been the only one madly disappointed, because I feel like I'm Superman when he was in Bizarro World in All-Star Superman, where everything doesn't seem to work properly. I hate to sound snobbish, but the way people discuss Force Awakens kind of depresses me. People look back on it already as, it was alright when it came out, or It was what I was expected, so it was good. And then that's it. People don't talk about great moments or discuss complex ideas, but describe it like how they would describe a transaction at McDonald's. Like, I wanted a safe franchise soft reboot, and I got it, so I liked it. This perspective of an audience that judged a story based on successful business decisions rather than artistic ones makes me sad, because I thought Star Wars could be more than that. It should always be ahead of the curve. Even when people didn't like it, it was still poignant and refused to be safe and be like other movies. And you could say it was because it was originally made by a rich dude who had all the money, so he didn't really care. But now Star Wars is made with this corporate approach, and Force Awakens is the most corporately made movie that's up there with The Mummy with Tom Cruise. Maybe it's because people became so jaded by the prequels that they were just flattered with this fidelity, but flattery isn't good enough if it's hiding a lack of content. There's an ugliness to Force Awakens, where every narrative decision doesn't come from an artistic standpoint, but from a business one. They didn't remake A New Hope because they had a story to tell, but because it was a safe strategy to rebrand Star Wars under this new management. And I know everyone sees through this, but we shouldn't just be okay with this. Not when it risks our ability to appreciate stories that do take risks, that don't offer immediate gratification but long-lasting reward. Movies are stories, and stories shouldn't adjust itself for the audience. Instead, it should be the audience that adjusts themselves for the story, because otherwise, where is that opportunity to see the world through someone else's eyes? And for that, we need to reconfigure a qualification for films. Passable isn't good enough anymore. Thanks for nothing.